and welcome everybody to speakers who will be including Paul Olivier, Yoshikazu Kawaguchi of Japan, Lance Hanshrow will be speaking on fermentation. 2 talks from now, so in 3 hours we have a fermentation talk. Steve Diver here, you can see is he's going to be speaking on natural farming microbial technologies. Then at the last talk of today, after Paul Olivier's talk of closed loop waste transformation farming, is going to be John Mwangi, and he will be speaking on deep litter pig farming with indigenous microorganisms. So how we have had this event structured is it's going to just be 7 hours each day or so, 7.5 technically the first 2 days, and then I think 8.5 the last day. But we have an hour for each speaker to talk and give their breakdown of what they want to express to everybody. And then after that, we will be spending half an hour with each speaker to take questions. And so I will be helping host and facilitate the question taking. But anyway, I just really want to extend a warm welcome to everybody for choosing to be here today, as time is very precious, and we all need to just appreciate the time we're here on this planet. And I feel that this is a very worthwhile occasion to bring us all together in love of soil, and love of food, and love of just the planet Earth that we all live on. And so I'm going to be starting today. My name is Peter Jackson, and I have a website, Cascading Natural Farming. And so I live in the Cascadian bioregion, which is basically the land of the Douglas fir and the Pacific salmon. So I had this idea back in July that we should get a lot of folks from a lot of different places together to share and connect and hopefully cross-pollinate and learn from each other. So today I am starting with a brief history of what is nature farming. And so in the modern era, we have many variant, of the term nature farming, many nature farming styles that have different associations and people associated with them. But at its heart, we really need to get into what is exactly the word nature. And so I'm going to read a little bit of some excerpts from a book called Nature Farming in Japan by Hui Lian Zhu. And it really kind of made, I'd been wondering this, what is the etymology of a language that has a totally different sort of history than the English that I'm a native speaker to, where I have a word nature and I have these preconceived notions of what nature means in the English language. What does it actually in Japanese mean? And so the Japanese word for nature is shizen, which is very similar to a Chinese word, ziran. Zi and Ran actually are 2 terms that go all the way back to the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And so the original meaning of the Ziran, which became Shizen, is not so much nature, it means the way things are. And in the 25th chapter of Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, it follows, "There's something that is perfect in its disorder, which is born before heaven and earth, so silent and desolate, it establishes itself without renewal and functions universally without lapse. We can regard it as the mother of everything. I don't know its name, hence when forced to name it, I call it Tao. When forced to categorize it, I call it great. Greatness entails transcendence. Transcendence entails going far. Going far entails return. Hence, Tao is great, heaven is great, the earth is great, and the human is also great. Within our realm, there are 4 greatnesses, and the human being is one of them. Human beings follow the earth follows heaven, heaven follows the Tao. The Tao follows the way things are. The last word, the way things are, is written in Chinese as Ziran. Zi means itself, and Ran means the state without changes. So that is where the etymology and genesis of what we call shizen for shizen noho or nature farming in Japan, it's rooted all the way back into Taoist philosophy. And so if we look at the way we see what is then like the English word nature, it's like we also are talking about like the sum total of existence. We're talking about, you know, life, the universe, and everything. But often humans are somehow left out in this way of looking of what we consider nature and what we are part of. So in the sort of Taoist tradition, humans follow nature. Humans can't help but be part of that order of the natural world. But ever since Plato to Descartes, founder of modern logic, and it is a large part of the sort of Abrahamic religions too, is that man is somehow separate from nature. Man is somehow not exactly, he's somehow better. He has imbued with this wonderful consciousness that separates him from the animals. But it appears that, if you feel that there was, definitely ecological like devastation and stuff that had happened pre-colonial contact of the Europeans to Japan, but at the same time, there was a sense of beingness and knowingness. In fact, even there's another Japanese word, chi-sei, which means knowingness. And I first came across that word in a book called Intelligence in Nature, where it was describing the ability of a slime mold to run a maze. And the fact is that the Japanese scientists weren't surprised that there was an intelligence in such a simple organism as a like sort of fungi or amoeba, like the slime molds are, and that they just happen to have this cultural tradition of feeling, there's a knowingness and a beingness infused in all sorts of things. And so between Taoism then cascading and forming along with the influence of Buddhism to create Zen, which is a endemic form of Buddhism to Japan, that there's always been a little more cultural appreciation, like where they cite their temples and inclusion of sacred trees as part of the temple complex. The way that this even go back further into looking at how the I Ching with its the trigrams that make the hexagrams, and the way they're based on like simple forms, but that these forms then build upon each other to create the whole of the universe, and that there is somehow this underlying form and order to nature. There's another Chinese word, li, which if you were to translate it directly into English, it gets translated as order, but a lot of the time it's actually what it really means is the markings in jade. Now, and you look at the sort of like grains of wood or the patterns of water flowing, and you see that that is order, that is very much order, but it is also got a fair amount of chaos and the pooling and swirling of vortices, and the way that nature is always just curved and winding. And so we have a lot of humans have always been trying to subvert nature and dominate it and bend it to their will, and straighten the course of the streams for commerce and shipping. And that does extend even Asian countries. They have been doing flood management and dike building and all that terracing and stuff for years and years, but there is still, you see by the time like books like Farmers of 40 Centuries by Franklin Hiram King are written, he was so impressed that they still had this concept of closing the loop and closing fertility, and that the traditional farming systems that before the importation of chemical agriculture and steam machinery, that there was the traditional peasant farming practices and integrated farming systems were very closed loop minded. They're very ecological in terms of always returning the manure and the shit to the fields, dredging out the canals, harvesting all sorts of different things, making compost, making sort of what we call like a leachate, or the fact that they have these long fermentation histories. So just to the basis of nature farming, to explain it, is really, though, it has this long traditional ancestry, both spiritually and culturally, and that it is very tied into these land bases the way it is now trickled out all over the world. So yeah, anyway, so the word, like I said, Shizen, it goes all the way back to the Tao Te Ching, and it's related to the way things are. So if we look at the word nature in English, there is actually, I guess, in Latin writings, the word culture came first, and then as humans started to eat up the natural world around them, that's where then the word nature was created in the Latin tongue. I think it might go like back to Cicero or something. But yeah, if we want to really like start to think of what is the philosophy of nature farming, there is a much different association, because humans are still part of nature. This is very similar to indigenous worldviews. So you can really see there's something to be said for thinking about what does that word mean to you, and then how is it actually like going to be felt by someone from maybe a culture where we might hear about nature farming from. So along the way, then the Meiji period, where rapid industrialization came to Japan, there was a push for this larger and larger consolidation of farms. More and more families had loss of productive income in the rural areas, so there's a demand for workers in the factories, so the cities started getting way bigger and bigger. And there was then also people felt that they were being poisoned and that the food wasn't tasting as good. And so then one person that was responsible for the first use of the term nature farming back into like the 1940s was a fellow named Okichi Okada. Now, Okichi Okada, he was born in 1882, and he was a trader for a little while, and then he did, I believe, lose some money, and then he met up with a group of spiritualists who are Shinto-based, called the Umoto movement. Some of the offshoots of that went on to form Reiki practitioners. Aikido was a martial art style invented by the bodyguard of the main spiritual leader of the Umoto movement. And Okichi Okada, after some time with them, split off and went and started his own group called the Church of World Messianity. And so from there, at first there was not so much the emphasis on farming, but there was this vision that was shared that there would be ability to create heaven on earth, and that we could have a lot of one second, I need to drink some water. So there was this decision or a practice started flowing where Okada and his followers were trying to live sort of alternative lifestyle to what was going on at the time. And I would like to share a quote of Okada's, which is that this is a poem he wrote. What a foolish thing. Today, man is polluting the earth's precious soil, which produces the treasure, vitally important food. So by 1941, Okada was conducting experiments and concluded that the chemical farthing method was not compatible nor in accordance with nature. Based on his interpretation of nature, he felt that more so humans were the elevated beings, and that the nature should be there to sort of serve the humans, but that he did respect its awesome power. And he wrote that if we grow crops with true love and respect towards the natural power of the soil will function to an astonishing degree. All the difficult problems and troubles that harass both farmers and consumers today can be solved through this method of cultivation. Originally, starting in the late 30s, they were calling it fertilizer-free farming. And as time went on, it was starting to be replaced by nature farming. I believe it was maybe 1949 that they were publishing a journal, and then that's where Okada started fully, after about 10 years of practice, had started to formulate his natural farming philosophy as use only compost for fertilizer, no fertilizer, no chemical fertilizer, no pests. As a result of the chemical fertilizers, that chemical fertilizers make the soil lose its original activities and become dead. And so, I guess it was actually 1950, fertilizer-free agriculture was changed to nature farming. So Okada was the first to coin the term nature farming. He wrote many articles. Some were titled The Great Revolution of Agriculture, The Victory of Nature Farming Cultivation, and The Principles of Nature Farming. And this was through his organization, Sekai Kyusei Kyo. So in 1951, Okichi Okada began correspondence across the ocean with Jerome Rodale, whose institute still is around today. They published also in 1951 a booklet called Introduction to Natural Farming, or Introduction to Nature Farming, actually. Nature Farming department was established by the Sekai Kyusei Kyo organization. And in 1952, Okada published his article, The Surprise of Nature Farming, in a nature farming thematic issue. So with that, you see that with the influence of the Shinto belief system, Okichi Okada had this reverence for the land. He also was a visionary, so he believed that how things were being imported from the West was the wrong thing, but he also envisioned a global society. And so from there, he only lived another year. And so he died in 1953 at the age, he died in 1955, sorry. Died in 1955 after 73 years of age. The folks from there continued promoting his spiritual philosophies. At this point, there's been about 30 different organizations that still carry on aspects of this. You have the Okichi Okada Association, you have Kyusei Nature Farming, which is part of the, Sekai Kyusei Kyo. Kyusei means saving the world. So the folks that have really helped propagate effective microorganisms to the world, they are called themselves the Kyusei Nature Farm, or Nature Farming. And so what Kyusei means is saving the world. So they literally mean like saving the world, natural agriculture. Due to Okada passing away in the 50s, the correspondence between the New Englanders and the Japanese ceased. But then about 40 years later, there was actually a resurgence, and a group called Shumai Natural Agriculture did partner with the Rodale Institute to test out some of the natural farming in Northeast America. So Shumai group goes back to 1962, or at least that's when they first began practicing the natural agriculture, nature farming. There was, in 1964, a Nature Farming Extension Society was formed. By 1969, the Natural Farming Extension Society stopped its operations, but then it continued in other forms. So the Shumai Group and its branches became an organization separate from Sekai Kyusei Kyo, and then the Kyusei nature farmers went on to Japan, or not from Japan to Thailand, and they created a nature farm in Thailand. There was a nature farm established in Nanakuli, Hawaii as well in 1972. And in 1975, there was even one set up, I guess, in California, Camarillo, California. But even by then, in 1979, nature farming had spread to Brazil as well. And that's where then, as all this was going on, these folks were doing things like composting and no tillage. They were learning to, harness the powers of nature and work with nature instead of against nature. But there was a meeting that really caused a lot of the Kyusei branch of nature farming to spread, which was Dr. True Higa, who is known as the founder of the effective microorganisms and various organizations around that. Dr. Higa happened to have a student who happened to belong to the Sekai Kyusei Kyo organization, and so he was able to make a great cross pollination between the use of EM1 and these people who are doing nature farming. And so that's where then you have all this modern day sort of bokashi knowledge that has spread far and wide. A lot of that traces itself back to that initial sort of fostering of EM1 within a already existent nature farming community. And over the decade of the 80s, you really had a lot of things start to pick up in the realm of effective microorganisms. By 1989, there was the first QSA Nature Farming Conference that happened, which was an influence on this weekend here, because they did 7 different international conferences, all related to the uses of effective microorganisms technology. And the very first one was held in Thailand. And there was only 3 delegates from North America, I believe, that year. But 2 of them had written a lot of papers with Dr. Higa, which was James Hornick and I think Sharon Parr. I don't know. Parr and Hornick, I believe, are their last names. Also in Japan, you had the International Nature Farming Development Center, which later became the International Nature Farming Research Center, was established in 1983. And so, yeah, by 82, you have the merger of the pre-existing nature farming community of Sekai Kyusei Kyo with the EM technologies. And then that partnership led to the creation of a lot of different things like the International Nature Farming Research Center, Effective Microorganism Research Organization. Both those are still active today and have a lot of great info on their websites, specifically related to those sort of fermentation microbe technologies. As the QSA Nature Farming Conference spread around the world, they went to Brazil, they went to Paris, they went to the United States. The very last one was held in New Zealand, I believe. And there was a really great mixing of the minds. You had folks like Ana Primavisi in Brazil presenting. You had the Lucas, famous biodynamic compost manufacturers, presented at the Paris conference. And then these sort of activities have continued into the modern era, to where now about 130 people use the effective microorganisms technology, and there's still a very strong lineal connection with Okichi Okada, who was the first to present this. Okay, so folks are asking for a sort of timeline. I will do some screen sharing and show you a little bit of a presentation I've made. This presentation can be found on my website, Cascadian Natural Farming. So where we are, we're still talking mostly about Okichi Okada. His theory is that fertilizers pollute the soil, weaken its power production, pests break out from the excessive use of fertilizers, the difference in disease, so the difference in disease incidence between resistant and susceptible plants is attributed to nutritional conditions inside the body of the plant. And of course, that vegetables and fruits produced by nature farming taste better than those by chemical farming. A lot of it also was based on that there was going to be economic and spiritual benefits, that these farming styles would be able to cope with growth in population, and that there would be conservation of the environment, and that we would be enhancing human health both spiritually and physically. Wait. Whoops. Oh, okay. I guess I was muted there for a second. Sorry. Mokichi. Anyway, so here is yeah, fertilizers pollute the soil, weaken its power production. Pests would break out from excessive use of fertilizers. Difference in disease incidence between resistant and susceptible plants is attributed to nutritional conditions inside the body. Vegetables and fruits produced by nature farming taste better than those by chemical farming. Dr. Higa, he started coming up with EM in the 70s, and then it started to then merge with the existing organizations and spread through the religious nature farming communities such as Sekai Kyusai. That led to spawning of then organizations like the Asia Pacific Natural Agriculture Network, International Nature Farming Research Center, and the EM Research Organization. EM has been used in large-scale bioremediation, large-scale use of farms, and is recognizable as a component in certain natural farmers to this day of what they do in terms of their practices. We have, there's two different books that are written by Dr. Higa. And one is called An Earth-Saving Revolution 1, and the other is called An Earth-Saving Revolution 2. And then if we then look to Fukuoka, Fukuoka is another fellow who is credited as a founding member of what is called nature farming, even though he was not involved in the organizations. He just did his own thing on his own farm, and people started to come and apprentice with him, and eventually it attracted an American in the late 1970s who spent 2 years on his farm and helped translate his book that's most famous, The One Straw Revolution, into English. But I'll get into some history about Fukuoka now. Fukuoka was born in Okinawa. He was the son of a farmer. He went to school to become a plant pathologist, and he had what we might call now a sort of existential crisis. And he realized that everything he saw of modernization, all of this progress, was not really doing anything that he considered beneficial for like the well-being and health of either the environment or his culture. And he had an epiphany one day when he was riding on a train, and he saw in an abandoned rice field that there was a feral grain straw of rice, that there was this one rice plant that growing abandoned, and it wasn't being fertilized by anybody, and it was one of the most healthy and robust specimens of rice he'd ever seen. And at the time, he'd been researching things like fungus issues with rice, and understood that the chemical agriculture trying to always do reactionary solutions to problems instead of actually looking at the treating the symptoms instead of the disease. And so he saw that this chemical agriculture mindset was causing no real benefits spiritually or culturally, and that he tried to return. And he wanted to live a more simpler life, so he went back to his home and started living in a small cabin. He initially tried to let go feral hundreds of orange trees that he had inherited, and because they'd already been handled by man, and pruned in the conventional style, as well as chemical agriculture was being used, that these plants sort of became weak and sickly, and a lot of them died, as he realized that because they'd already been pruned, they'd forgotten how to grow themselves. So he started planting a lot of seeds and started trying to look at what is the natural ideal of how plants and trees will grow themselves. So he not just grew rice in a fashion that was trying to be more natural, that he also was doing this with trees. Now, I guess he would use grafted trees, but he would ask when he would get his oranges from the nursery that they at least not do any topping of the grafted trees. but that's because he spent so much time studying seedlings that he realized what he saw as the way an orange tree really wanted to grow was in a more like globe shape, and then that like apple trees and the like, they wanted to grow more of a triangular shape, and if left to their own devices, that they would be able to grow themselves without fertilizer, grow themselves without any pruning. And he also created a whole very unique food forest of, because there was no soil under, or there was no sort of cover crop growing under these trees. They were basically bare soil underneath, and very degraded soil at that, that he did start just broadcasting a lot of clover, daikon radish, got lots of other things, growing all in a sort of integrated farming system that then started returning the fertility to the land without the need for any chemicals and without his hand necessarily being needed to guide them along. And that's where his nature farming, as Fukuoka called it, is similar to Okichi Okada's nature farming, but that while they both use the term shizen noho, that Okada felt that man, was privileged as being able to, have nature more at his disposal. Fukuoka really believed that nature was for every being, and that his sort of more Buddhist rather than Shinto perspective was that we are here to share the whole planet with all these other creatures. And he really did embody a lot of just a idealism. Like I've heard Fukuoka referred more as like a philosopher scientist and then farmer, because he was trying to envision what is nature when we haven't really even been exposed to enough nature to know what nature is. Like if you've grown up in all sorts of degraded landscapes, how do you get back to studying from the source and not just mimicking, but actually being part of it? One of my favorite quotes from Fukuoka comes from a documentary made at the end of his life. In the documentary, he's talking about how he works like a bird. He only sows seeds. And at the end of his life, now that he's too old to work, the birds are doing the work for him. And parts of his old farm have been allowed to basically rewild and go back into a sort of later terrestrial stage of the ecosystem. But he did really see a lot of potential in this approach of basically trying not to do more and more, but how to figure out how to do less and less. And so how is it that you can try to remove the intervening hand of man? How do you take out the discriminating mind so that way you don't have to see so much about, where is it that you can take yourself out instead of putting yourself in? And then that's maybe where we can really find where we belong within nature itself, instead of trying to always think we know better, and again always trying to treat symptoms instead of the root underlying causes, that we end up maybe sometimes, unintentional consequences have gotten us all in this present moment here of wide scale ecological disaster. And so Fukuoka was really a visionary too, in terms of he believed we could just go regreen the deserts. And that's one of the last books he wrote in his life, was called Greening the Desert. And he was an advocate for seed ball technology, that he considered a microcosm of nature in and of itself, where you can have up to 100 seeds in a clay ball, and then they will, and clay, compost, and seeds. So I think it's about a third of each. But with creating these little balls full of diversity, you can let nature choose what will actually work in those ecosystems. And that has even gotten to the point where nations such as Thailand have even gotten to dropping seed balls out of planes as a reforestry practice. And so while that might not be as efficient as individuals who are able to go and plant and find the little spots where moisture might seep more in the dry seasons. It is very, beautiful that there is such a man who had envisioned a way that we could start to reverse the spread of deserts by not having to do much more than just be like a bird. So Fukuoka is very famous also for his approach to rice farming. He did not flood the fields seasonally like his neighbors. He did a few little floodings at the beginning of the season to discourage weeds that weren't as water tolerant, but he did a bit quasi like dry farming of rice where it was intercropped during the wintertime, which was before his time had been traditionally practiced for probably hundreds or maybe thousands of years before that. But he would grow a winter crop of rye and barley. And then as he was getting ready to harvest that, right towards the end of that, he would be throwing out his seed balls of rice. And then those would be starting to sprout. They'd come in, trample the seedlings a little bit, but they're harvesting the winter grain crop. And then after they've threshed the winter grain crop, they throw over the mulch onto the already sprouting seedlings of rice, and then repeat the same thing during the rice harvest, where right before the rice would get harvested, they would throw out the seed balls of the rye and the barley and things like clover, and then create a continuous mulch loop and always be restoring the fertility that was stored in the stalk layer of the grains back onto his field of rice. And it did take a number of years before he was stopped being mocked by neighbors for his seemingly crazy ways. But from there, he was able to get like 2-3 times the yield as his soil health continuously improved through the continuous use of mulch and maybe a few small amendments like occasional manure or fire ash if the ducks and chickens hadn't been loose through the old fields. But just through the constant mulching over the years, he was able to create such a healthy ecosystem full of things like spiders. Actually, one year he said he tried fire ash as a fertility amendment, and he didn't see as many spiders. So in One Straw Revolution, he says he discontinued using fire ash after that. But he talks a lot about the discriminating mind and how the university specialists who have been trained in this method of breaking things down into their separate parts and thinking that they could make the whole again from connecting these little parts, but broken down, they wouldn't quite understand the whole general sort of mishmash, because he joked about like one year they might have to send a frog specialist, next year they might have to send a spider specialist, next year they might have to send a specialist in some sort of wasp, because no matter what pest was maybe starting to gain a foothold, there'd be something ecologically that would correct the balance. And so just by being non-intervening in the fertility of his field except through some mulching, and not ever using any chemicals or any tillage, that he was able to create a very healthy and robust ecosystem that was basically self-managing. And that's where he called it, what he did, Shiza Noho or nature farming, but he also called it do nothing farming. And that is a very beautiful perspective. And he ended up being a huge influence on some other folks who are later on still practicing or teaching nature farming to this day. So for instance, on Saturday we will have translated Yoshikazu Kawaguchi, who in 1979 read the One Straw Revolution, and about a dozen years later in 1991 he established the Kame Natural Farming or Natural Agriculture Training Area, or he also has written several books. One is called Standing in an Exquisite Field, and his methods are a little less dogmatic. He does do some weeding by hand. He uses the philosophy that weed and grass are not your enemies, though. No need to fertilize, no need to battle the insects, those sort of basic similar, but Okada had about 4 or 5 principles. Fukuoka had about 5 principles, and then Yoshikazu Kawaguchi has stripped it down to more about 4 basic principles. But generally, the ethos is the same, that we're trying to minimize our disturbance, and the more we can just work on more just creating the right conditions for the beauty to unfold before our eyes, basically. That if we as humans work not against nature and not trying to so much mimic nature, but actually become part of nature once again, that seems to be a large part of what is nature farming. So here's a comparison. You have the 5 principles of Kiyosei nature farming: produce foods which can sustain, promote human health, be beneficial economically and mentally to both, or spiritually to producers and consumers, and it's supposed to be practicable by anyone with long-term durability. It's great for the environmental integrity and pays respect to nature, but also that it needs to be responsible for production to match the growth of the population. And then Fukuoka's principles: do not till, do not fertilize, do not use any chemical pesticides or herbicides, no weeding, and no pruning. Then I would like to I'm going to talk about some other nature farmers for a few minutes too, but I'd like to share some more quotes with you folks. Let me see. So Okichi Okada said, civilization as we know it is transitory. It will pass away with the dawn of the new age as the true civilization is born. He also said, God gave soil the job of producing food and endowed it with the properties necessary to sustain human life and enable each person to perform his mission in optimum health. Fukuoka, he said, on this planet, we do not have something we can call nature anymore. We have lost it. We do not have nature we can go back to. What we must do is search for nature, but human knowledge cannot do it. We can only ask nature. Therefore, we, and especially seed companies in the world, should collect all kinds of seeds on the planet and offer them to God, nature, and pray. This kind of attitude toward nature is necessary. Of course, even if we pray, God will not say anything. We may not be inspired either. Nevertheless, the plants which start growing are God's answer. Nature will teach you. He talked about the power of nature is great because the natural structure is solid, 3-dimensional, not horizontal or 2-dimensional. That if you get your, mountain peach trees, you have kiwis growing up them. Above the kiwis, there's a type of melon. So 3 types of fruit can grow at different heights. And so that is getting back into, sort of food forest and agroforestry, but natural production is greater than man-made production. The structure is solid. Humans are destroying the power of nature. We have only 1/4 of the growing power of nature left. We are not increasing fertility or production, but rather trying to prevent production from failing by using fertilizers. The world is digging itself into a bottomless pit with modern agriculture. The simple hearth of the small farm is the true center of our universe. Scientific thought is leading you away from a healthy life. Even if the practice of conventional or organic agriculture is a dangerous digression, it cannot be sustained if you have to rob part of the earth to feed another. Most farmers begin by asking, what if I do this or what if I do that, but only dissipate themselves that way. My approach is just the opposite. Seek the pleasant, natural way of farming in order to make the work easier, not harder. I ask, how about not doing this or that? By actual practice, I finally reached the conclusion there is no need to plow, no need to apply artificial fertilizer, no need to use pesticides at all. Most of the work of farming is created by tampering with nature, which causes negative side effects. Very few agricultural practices are even necessary, just scattering seed and spreading straw on the soil and harvesting. So he also says a farmer does not grow something in the sense that he or she creates it. That human is only a small part of the whole process by which nature expresses its being. The healing of the land and the purification of the human spirit, it's the same process. And many people think that when we practice agriculture, nature is helping us in our efforts to grow food. Sorry, I got distracted for a second. Many people think that when we practice agriculture, nature is helping us in our efforts to grow food. This is an exclusively human-centered viewpoint. We should instead realize that we are receiving that which nature decides to give us. A farmer does not grow something in the sense that he or she creates it. That human is only a small part of the whole process by which nature expresses its being. Oh wait, I already, anyway, that's from another same part of the same quote. The farmer has little influence over the process other than being there and doing his or her small part. Life on a small farm may seem primitive, but by living such a life, we become able to discover the great path. I believe that one who deeply respects his neighborhood and everyday world in which he lives will be shown the greatest of all worlds. The real path to natural farming requires that a person know what unaltered nature is, so that he or she can instinctively understand what needs to be done and what must not be done to work in harmony with its processes. We must find our way back to true nature. We must set ourselves to the task of revitalizing the earth, regreening the earth, sowing seeds in the desert. That is the path society must follow. He continues with a lot of these sort of philosophies. He talks even about like there's no time in modern agriculture for a farmer to write a poem or compose a song, which is why he felt that the do nothing agriculture would also help like flourishing and blossoming of human beings. And as he said, is like there's the true point of natural farming is not the cultivation of the soil or the crops so much, but it's actually the cultivation and perfection of the human being. And so in this conference too, we are going to have some speakers share very philosophically, because it's about why are we doing this? It's not just so much the how do you do this, but why are we here on this planet? Why are we doing this? Is it regressive, or is it very forward thinking? And it's a little bit of both. It takes some of the ancient and it looks to the future, and we're just trying to be here and respect the traditions that led to this. Some of what Fukuoka was practicing does go back into some old books. I'm gonna go and talk for a second about traditional farming. So okay, there was documentation of integrated farming systems for aquaculture and vegetables going back over 4,000 years ago in a document called the Yu Hao Bin in China. Almost just as long ago, they were talking about raising fish in the rice paddies as a sort of mixed cropping polyculture, as we call it now. The terraces and ponds go back thousands of years ago. I was just reading recently about a civilization that flourished in China for like 1,300 years or something until about 4,000 years ago as well. And so they were doing it before 4,000 years ago with the creation of terraces and ponds and rice farming and fish in the rice paddies. But it just necessarily wasn't, maybe took 1,000 years before it was written down, or we've even, if there was older writings, that was lost. And then, by about 1,500 years ago, you have a book called the Qimen Yao Shu, and that helped preserve fragments of other earlier ancient texts, some of which are only mentioned in that book, but there's, I think, almost 200 earlier farming texts mentioned in this book called the Qimen Yao Shu, which then translated is techniques by which common people make their livelihood. Then more in the 1300s, you have a book called the Nongshu, which was published by a guy who's also famous for the invention of movable woodblock printing type that was really revolutionary at the time in terms of the Chinese printing press. And in these books, you see there's very advanced knowledge related to horticulture and breeding, forestry plantings. There's over like, you know, almost a 1,000 years of writing detailing that if you're, you know, clearing a hillside to replant for your specific timber crops, that the first 3 years of your timber crops you can be growing grain under them until the trees are big enough. There's a modern day study showing that the remnants of what is still in existence of silk and mulberry farming in relation with rice farming, that some places that they'll find up to 200 different food crops in these farm ecosystems. So there is, you know, long history of humans fostering the biodiversity, and the fact that you can have also not just fish in your rice paddies, but that you can have ducks was written about in some of these ancient Chinese books. So some of what Fukuoka was doing with the continuous grain cropping cycles, and some of what other modern natural farmers like Takao Furuno, who's really helped bring back this ancient duck rice polyculture, that these are very ancient. And so you have even the genesis of bokashi, I believe, comes from a book called the Nongzang Quan Shu, which was brought over to Japan during the shogunate era, and then led to, you know, certain advances in the Japanese farming production. But that there is these very ancient methods that were part of just traditional agriculture, and that it wasn't really until then the Green Revolution and modern farming started being imported that these things started becoming lost, to where you had then folks start to have to create a name for no fertilizer farming when it used, or nature farming as it became when it started. That was just what it was, just farming. That was the farming of East Asia for thousands of years. They had very complex biodiverse ecosystems with constant cycling of nutrients. And it's just, I don't know. I mean, it's like cultural amnesia happened due to the rapid onslaught of industrialization spread through colonialism. So there was a fellow, he said that successful farming is paying attention to seasons, weather, and quality of soil to adapt work to save labor and increase yields. That was then continued, you know, as like that's what Fukuoka talks about. Of course, you know, I mean, a successful farmer would do these things, but what farmer wants to work so hard that they don't have time for anything else, right? And that's where Fukuoka did want to give pause and give you know, time for artistic pursuits and philosophical and spiritual pursuits, that farming could be something that doesn't necessarily have to just cause you to be bankrupt because you're spending so much money on machinery and chemicals to try to chase these yields that were continually decrease as the pests increase. And I like to use a quote about both Fukuoka and Takao Furuno that Bill Mollison says in his last interview at this permaculture, probably the last International Permaculture Convergence that he was alive at for sure. He said that what the duck rice production of Takao Furuno did was it allowed you to collapse space. And then what Fukuoka with his rice to barley cycling was able to collapse time. And so both of these people are famous for what they were able to accomplish with revitalizing what really in a lot of ways is, while it's natural farming and nature farming, natural agriculture, however, you know, we want to translate it, that it at the end is really a huge part of traditional farming. And I'd like to share a little bit about, you know, some other folks. Master Cho. Master Cho is the founder of Korean natural farming. He studied in Japan. He's been starting his own organization since 1967. He first started, like, you know, working with other folks and creating you know, groups to help disseminate these these wonderful sort of like philosophies, and working with nature, and also just really, actual like science, and using modern knowledge, that not throwing out so much the baby with the bathwater, but taking all the things we learn with microscopes and studying microorganisms and understanding plants at their different life cycles, and the power of enzymes and hormones. So Master Cho, he talks about how he was influenced by different books. One was The True Aspect of Enzymes, and then one was this fellow Yasushi, I believe, Onui. Yasushi Onui. He was the fellow who coined what's called Periodism, which now we kind of take for granted. Those ideas of a plant might want lots of nitrogen as it's coming into its earlier stages of growth, and that as it finishes up, you will want to have more like the things that help with the sweetness of the fruit, and strength of the cell walls. So you want to then have things like calcium and phosphorus at the end. At the time of Onui's talking about that, it was probably lesser known. But now we take it more for granted. But this aspect too that's really unique to Master Cho's stuff is that he really has a big push towards capturing the different growth hormones of different plants at different times, using these herbal syrups with sugar and plant matter that are called Heavenly Blessing green juice, or an English fermented plant juice, fermented fruit juice, and these different sort of concoctions that can be made with the ingredients you find at home in your kitchen. You can really boost fertility and productivity, and also time it. That's a big part of Cho's system of what he teaches, is the timing behind all these different things, and how he compares it to a very symphonic practice of how do we play the right notes at the right time for the song as it crescendos from seedling to harvest. Cho also helped promote the capturing of indigenous microorganisms using buried rice boxes. That's very old too, though. It's in the paper published by the College of Tropical Agriculture, University of Hawaii. Houghton Park mentions that it might go back at least hundreds of years. From my research, it seems that it's probably, it goes back at least to probably like 1637 with the Nongsheng Quan Shu, or I've probably mispronounced that. Nongzheng Quan Shu by Zhu Guangyi, who is also the first Jesuit of Chinese descent. That's where that fellow, he was, but anyway, I digress. If you look up Matteo Ricci and Zhu Guangyi sometime, though, if you're interested, that's how Roman Catholicism also spread to China around the time that book was written, and that's when a lot of ancient Mediterranean classics such as Plato and Euclid were translated into Chinese the first time with the help of this Jesuit missionary in the 1600s. But so the capturing of indigenous microorganisms, though, maybe goes even further back than like 1600s Japan and China, with this whole notion of capturing microorganisms on some rice in a fertile mountain valley. If you look at it, some of the microorganisms used in both EM and IMO include Aspergillus molds, which are used for the production of alcohol. And some of the oldest pottery ever found in China, 9,000 years old, had Aspergillus on it, because certain things are too starchy for a yeast to digest into alcohol on its own. So back in ancient Egypt, folks were malting barley, and in parts of Asia, such as India, China, Japan, Korea, there's these very old traditions of making rice wine, which is heirloom cultures of molds that do the saccharification. They turn the starches into the sweeter sugars. So then you have these heirloom cultures that can be passed down in places like Korea called Nuruk, or we have the which is Aspergillus culture mixed with lots of yeast and lactic acid bacteria. Those are also then going to be in this like notion of trying to capture microorganisms in the forest, and why do these practitioners of Korean natural farming go for these sweet smells? Because culturally there's this whole history of capturing molds for fermentation of starches and grains, and creating these heirloom cultures. There's even theories that originally the Aspergillus cultures might have been more toxic and actually contained the what's known as aflatoxins, and then that through human association, the basically like sort of an Aspergillus niger, a deadly black mold, got domesticated and became benign. And so it is really interesting that aspect of anyway, the genesis of what became now as known as IMO. It culturally and traditionally also fits into this nature farming of Master Cho, in that it goes back 9,000 years on, according to traces of pottery, that we have humans having used these indigenous fungi and lactic acid bacteria and yeast for creating beverages of alcohol. So then we that's pretty good introduction. Cho, Master Cho has come out to Hawaii a bunch of times. He's been to West Coast North America once, but he also went to the Philippines, and that's actually where then we have Gil Carindang. Gil Carindang is speaking tomorrow from the Philippines, and Gil Carindang is known as the father of organic farming and natural farming in the Philippines. Gil Carindang studied with Master Cho a little over 20 years ago and studied in Japan, and by 2003 had come to the United States on a Fulbright scholarship. And in a lot of ways, how like there in 1998 there was someone in Florida who, in collaboration with Master Cho, was doing some research on the indigenous microorganisms, but how it started to get to becoming more popular in the English speaking world on the internet, I have to give a lot of credit to Gil Carindang, because he came over in 2003. He wrote a booklet on how to make your own bionutrients and how to capture the indigenous microorganisms and make your own homemade lactic acid bacteria. Gil knew also about EM1, which at the time, EM1 used to be sold. It contained Aspergillus fungi. It had other molds in it, such as you find in tempeh, like Rhizopus and mucor. And then, of course, lactic acid bacteria, yeast, photosynthesizing bacteria. It also used to contain a lot of actinomycetes, but you don't see those listed on the EM sold in the modern era. It's down to just the lactic acid bacteria, yeast, and photosynthesizing bacteria. But Gil understood that EM is in a large part, though in an original EM, it did have a lot of the fermenting fungi, and that it was lots of lactic acid bacteria. And so when you make your own homemade lactic acid bacteria, you're also going to have a lot of indigenous yeast with there. And so Gil came to USA 2003, worked with Steve Diver, who is also a speaker. Steve's speaking right after me, actually, specifically on the indigenous microorganisms and effective microorganisms technologies. And so that stuff then started to filter out more and more on the internet over the years. Gil had a great website called the Unconventional Farmer. And in 2008, he was out on the Big Island, Hawaii, speaking. I think Master Cho first went to Hawaii in 2005, but between Master Cho coming to Hawaii and Gil Carindang coming to North America in 2003, that laid the genesis for a lot of folks worldwide to start to read more about this stuff in the English language. And now at this point, it's very common that you'll start to, well, not very common, but more of the small scale farmers I know of in the county I live, Skagit County in Washington State, they hear of at least Korean natural farming, or they know about effective microorganisms. And so in 25 years, there's been a huge impact of these microbial technologies originating in Asia coming to North America. I personally have been working with them a lot the last decade, even if I didn't really know what I was doing at first or calling it. I first heard of EM in 2008 and IMO in 2010, and then started learning about bokashi and other aspects of Kyusei nature farming and Korean natural farming, as well as reading lots of stuff by Fukuoka and watching documentaries and stuff. Now we're in this modern era where, yes, we still have folks as well. Subhash Palkar is from India. He will be speaking. My time zone, it's going to be Saturday, but on the third day we have Subhash Palkar speaking, who is a great guru from India that he's helped popularize his own form of natural farming, where he does a fermentation of cow dung and the native soil from a healthy farm. And he does his fermentation with the aid of raw sugar, or jaggery as it's also called, and then pulse flour, pulse being, a sort of crop like lentils or something. And so that kind of brings us up to speed, I guess, about all different eras of nature farming, different personalities, different types. You can find a lot of information too, about all these people. But for now, I'm just going to think, maybe see if anyone has any questions. And so I'm going to stop that screen sharing. And yeah, I see I have one question. Someone says, what is the difference of natural farming of China and they called natural farming of Korea? Which came first? I don't know if I would say that it's more about the shared traditions and crossover than necessarily did all this originate in China or did it originate in Korea or Japan. Aspects of it are going to be endemic to each culture, and China obviously does have very ancient roots in all this, but so do the other countries. And in some ways, Japan, I know maybe a little bit more about their history, so I can just answer more about the recent history of the last couple hundred years in Japan, just from my understanding about once the Portuguese started coming there, and then the influence and from the reaction of trying to kind of be a closed country for a while until then the Meiji era, which then was when Japan finally really opened up to the West. And I don't know. Oh, I'm going to turn on a light. It got dark. But the difference between natural farming in Korea and Japan, there's China as well, that they all share the difference, and they all share a lot of the different microbes consortiums, that the microbes and cultural practices are very old. If you read books like Farmers of 40 Centuries by Franklin Hiram King, he did tour around all these different places, and he details different practices he saw that in some places they're like Japan, they were using lots of seaweed as a fertility amendment, that there was always going to be the use of night soil, aka human manure. There was all the dredging of canals and stuff. There was complicated methods of compost manufacturing, which I found kind of super inspiring, and to me seemed like a primitive bokashi ancestor, which was, there's a picture in Farmers of 40 Centuries of a compost pile where it was sealed with clay, which is then, think about it, it's like turning a kimchi pot upside down. And so that fermentation seems to be a big part of traditional agriculture. If you look at just the history of the fermentation of food, and if you look at the constant recycling of nutrients, that some of these preparations were bound to be quite smelly, but then sometimes there would be probably lots of incorporating of like charcoal into your humanure, in which case then you're creating biochar. And so the history of charcoal use in agriculture goes back a long time in probably all these countries. And in the modern era, we can see then, of course, different recipe differences. For instance, I actually really can't even speak much about nature farming of China, because it's just that I interact less with those people on the internet. China, with their modern politics, it's just, I don't see, when I'm researching this, I see the writings come from folks from Korea and Japan mostly. So that's where most of what I know about nature farming is going to be based on, more so Korea and Japan. And then what I've read is more about China is the traditional agriculture. So I can't really, I guess, speak too much more than that. But someone else also asked, will recordings of this be available? And if so, where? We're going to be releasing it all on YouTube, hopefully before Christmas. We might probably also put it on BitChute, but if you go back to, cascadingnaturalfarming.org, or go to Facebook, Cascading Natural Farming, you'll probably within a matter of weeks be able to find all these talks. We're going to make them free and openly available for everybody. So there is 2 questions answered. See if there's anything else in the chat, because I can keep talking too after this. But let's see. Oh. Someone asks, is there an outline or timeline that can give us this information with correct spelling and links? And I said, yeah, you can find a lot of that from the presentation I was sharing, which is linked. You can find it. It's an editable Google Doc still right now, but you can find it on my website. The modern duck rice farmer spelling is Takao Furuno, Takao Oh, someone already got that. All right, cool. And that catches up on questions. I guess I'll check back for questions in a second, but I'm going to keep going for another 10, 15 minutes. So let's look at the history of fermentation as a timeline. So I'm going to go back to screen share. Here we go, folks. Okay. So, sorry, that's just going to be there. We have malting of beer going back in Egypt. I could update this. I definitely, this is about a year and a half old, since I made this timeline. But so really further back, even off the screen, you would have aspergillus mold found in pottery 9,000 years old, and then we have malting of beer, which, if you don't know what malting beer is, again, it refers to a saccharification process, that the hard grains of wheat or barley soaked in water would not make beer on their own with yeast, because they're complex starches, not sugars. And so in ancient Egypt, they were taking sacks of the grain and letting it sit in the Nile for a day to just barely sprout, so then that they could dry and grind them and thus is the malting process, that the malting brings out sugars that are naturally there because the starch is there to help the seed sprout. So that once the seed's actually sprouting, but you don't want it to get too sprouted, you can sprout and then dry or boil your grains, and that's the malting process. So beer making is very, very ancient activity. Our most ancient beers, even probably, way further back off the timeline, would be you have still indigenous beverages such as chicha, where our spit happens to have that same enzyme that is in the sprouting grain, that's in the aspergillus molds and rhizopus and mucor molds, which is you have amylase. And so the amylase enzyme is used in still some beverages in places like Amazon and maybe very rural Mexico, where they'll take grains like corn, chew them up, and spit them into a bucket, and then cover with water. And that is an indigenous microorganism fermentation, but also assisted by the amylase in the spit. And so the spit would have that enzyme in it to allow the breakdown and saccharification begin. But yeah, we have writings about aspergillus almost 2,300 years old. If we look at European fermentation history, the alewives and the like, it was often like women were part of the whole fermentation culture and there's very much like, a lot of European fermentation was also based on winemaking of fruit. So you didn't need any saccharification to occur. You didn't need amylase with fruit wines because fruit wine already has so much digestible sugar from the juice that it can go straight to wine. But then what's really interesting is that the ancient yeast of European descent was a top floating yeast, because we didn't have these modern sort of things like a glass carboy with an airlock. You'd have generally like more a large barrel for your fermentation. And so the yeast that used to be predominantly used was called Saccharomyces Pasteurianism. And it was the top floating yeast because it would start to form a sort of bubbly pellicle at the top to keep out other microorganisms from getting in and disturbing its food source as it made the alcohol. But then you had the industrialization happen as German culture started getting more modern, that they started fermenting in even larger and larger quantities and started creating anaerobic fermentation environments with things like probably barrels, but as well, I think they started getting into like, steel that was, it's probably thousands of, once they probably started scaling up to like thousands of gallons fermenting at once, that's when they started getting into more an anaerobic fermentation, which then caused the Saccharomyces Pasteurianism to lose out historically. And now the most common yeast we see for fermentation for alcohol is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But lots and lots of things, including even lactic acid bacteria, make alcohol from sugars. Reason why a lot of microorganisms do make alcohol is an antiseptic, similar to why microorganisms make antibiotics, that it is for fighting and discouraging other organisms that they're in competition with. Well, sometimes microorganisms are mutualistic. Other times we see that things can be very competitive and exclude out others from their chosen food source. Why we have penicillium molds, for instance, making an antibiotic, is that they're trying to discourage other microbes from eating their food source. So humans have been fascinated by alcohol. We've also been, really influenced by the lactic acid bacteria in the fermentation of cabbage with salt. So you have this modern day sauerkraut to kimchi making. Tempeh with molds that goes back maybe 1,000 years. I think the writings about it go more 200-300 years, but molds such as rhizopus for fermenting soybean and grain, that's very old. And then let's see, enzymes are part of the miraculous nature of what drives like pretty much every living process. Enzymes are made up of amino acids and they act as catalysts to biochemical reactions. They are speeding up processes that would normally take a much longer time through just chemical weathering or heat. And they often function in chains. So, one enzyme does this and the next enzyme does this, similar to how we were talking about amylase taking the starch, making it into a sugar, and then the yeast enzymes are able to make the sugar into an alcohol. And then the vinegar enzymes can make the alcohol into acetic acid. And then the acetic acid, once that maybe gets drinking as dilute vinegar for our own health or used on our salads or something, our own enzymes are going to break that acetic acid back into probably like a water molecule and something else. I don't know what happens with but it is interesting then, for instance, some things like acetic acid and vitamin C, actually, though their acids cause an alkalizing reaction in our own bodies. We have 5,000 known examples of enzymes. And then nature, of course, because she works with the same building blocks and stuff, there's all these things like, cellulose being a complex starchy fiber, and that then nature made the perfect breakdown for it with cellulase. Like anything ending with ASE would generally denotes an enzyme. So for instance, chitin is broken down by chitinase. Amylose, which is a starch, is broken down by amylase. Proteins are broken down by things like protease. And pectin is broken down by pectinase. Supposedly, the person responsible for some of the bokashi geneticists in the shogunate era was a fellow named Noao Kanetsugu. He was also written about in some period plays of the time. So yeah, from the fermentation cultural history to the modern era, where we're doing a lot of these modern natural farming preparations such as bokashi or the different stages of indigenous microorganisms, we're all seeing that this all kind of traces back, trickles back first couple hundred years, then goes deeper back thousands of years. But now and we can see again, like there's that picture of the compost pile in Farmers 40 Centuries, and it's covered with clay seal. Steve Diver, sorry about the earlier mispronunciation, Steve, but Steve Diver, he has pictures on his Facebook he's shared of going to India and seeing biodynamic farming preps used on different compost piles that all also were sealed with this clay seal. And that he was asked if he could identify which of the 2 or 3 piles had the biodynamic farming preparations used on them. And he was able to see that the one that was the most cracked had therefore been generating the most heat. And so therefore, from there, he was able to understand that, obviously that's the one that had the sort of biostimulant, sort of bioaugmentation going on with the biodynamic preparations. There's the picture in Farmers of 40 Centuries, and it does have a lot of cracks. And Franklin Hiram King writes that he's curious why people would be doing this. Why are they doing all this to make their compost, when what he speculated at the time, such a finish would have the effect of a seal, showing if people were distilling the compost. But I see it more from the angle of he was kind of missing out maybe on the compost bokashi sort of genesis. And then if you look at the history of what we call modern day composting, that there's a lot of it does come from India. The indoor composting method, as Sir Albert Howard called it, and they, while maybe added some of their own touches to it, this was all very old stuff going on a very long time. So anyway, what I will say though is with a lot of this, my philosophy at the end, it really comes down to healthy soils, but not just healthy soils. It's where heal thy soils, right? Where the breakdown of the word healthy, heal thy soils, right? And then we will be healing thy guts, right? And a large part of this all across the board, which we see in the traditions of fermentation and we see in the soil science of the modern era, is that it's very, common knowledge about probiotics in our foods like yogurt. which the definition of probiotic is live microorganisms administered in adequate amounts conferring health benefit on the host. So we now have, for instance, some people, their version of natural farming, more so they call it probiotic farming. Like there's Probiotic Farmers group on Facebook, and that's then we have the prebiotics, right? And so probiotics need the prebiotics because the prebiotics are the fibers that then the probiotics have those enzymes, right, to digest those fibers. So the prebiotic fibers are long-term food sources, and that's why it's better in our modern sort of nature farming concoctions that we are focusing on not a cheap food source for the microbes, that we are giving them something a little more to work with, and that then it's similar. Then, I mean, for instance, Joanna Campy from Remineralize the Earth, she will be speaking on rock dust, and that is a huge thing because all those microbes are able to activate and chelate and enzymatically get into the soil food web, all these different minerals, and sometimes these trace minerals might be missing for certain food crops based on a site, you know, or even if they're native species of plants, maybe there's been so much soil erosion that they really, things like rock dust in combination with these like probiotics, prebiotics really can then create just wonderful, miraculous soil that confers great nutritional healing benefit back into that whole, like, why are we farming? We're trying to not just heal the land, but we're trying to also heal ourselves. And we have all this modern diseases that are basically caused by food instead of our food healing us, and instead of instead of actually like creating harmony and balance on this planet, we've created a lot of just what's called eubiosis or dysbiosis instead of eubiosis. Like in the gut, if you have a healthy gut ecosystem, it's eubiosis. If your gut's out of whack from antibiotics or processed foods, you have dysbiosis. And then if you get the prebiotics and probiotics, you create the symbiotics, and you can start to heal the gut, as folks like back in Hippocrates' time said. So, okay, I'm gonna stop screen sharing. One more question I got. I can't get the Q&A up for some reason. Well,
it says grape fermentation to wine. How old?
Oh, grape fermentation to wine? That's got to be 4,000 or 5,000 years old, I'd say, at least. That's not exactly my area of specialties. I know apple fermentation, domestication goes back probably 6,000 years, but grapes probably with the Etruscans and stuff probably goes back 4,000 or 5,000 years. But yeah, thanks for listening to my talk, Steve. Thanks for listening to my talk, everyone. I think, yeah, that's a big part of what I got. I don't know. Can you think of anything I could wrap it up with?
Well, it was such a great history. You pulled a lot of things together, including some really old, obscure Chinese text, right?
Yeah. If folks are interested more on that, the ancient Chinese text, there I shared on Facebook last year some screenshots of a book. I think it's called Integrated Farming Systems in China or something, and it really goes into the history and talks about kind of different waves of migrations and colonizations that happened within China, but also ancestral things like the rice, duck, mulberry polyculture systems.
Someone wants to know about the presentations. They think they will be loaded onto YouTube.
Yeah, the presentations will all be loaded onto YouTube within a few months or a few weeks. Hopefully, maybe even by next week. But just definitely, if you check back by like winter solstice time. So the book title, I believe, what I just mentioned about going into traditional agriculture and integrated farming systems, I believe it's just called Integrated Farming Systems of Ancient China or something. There is a few pictures I'd screenshot if you go to the photos on Cascadian Natural Farming's Facebook page. So, yeah.